Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is called the last lecture for a reason because it is. And I'm sure for many of you, this is a happy day and a dance day and all that kind of stuff because you don't have to listen to me anymore. So that's why I put this screen up and call it the last lecture. This course is called U.S. History Survey. And by calling it survey, it means that we get to choose, as professors, we get to choose the stuff that we will talk about. And we get to choose how far we go with it. I happen to be someone that believes that it's hard to establish something called history if we're talking about something that just happened. And by that, I mean that for my purposes, there is no history yet about the Trump administration. There is journalism about the Trump administration, but there is not yet time. We usually say it takes at least 10 years for history to be established in terms of professional historians doing research to find out what really happened. Right now, it's most everything about the current administration, or the administration that just ended, is still wrapped up in preliminary research, and the documents aren't there and the archives aren't there. So generally speaking, I usually end this course with the election of Barack Obama in 2008. And I don't talk too much about him other than the fact that we'll see how he got elected. So what I'm going to be talking about today are really three presidents. You might say, I guess we could say the last three, not counting Trump. It would be Obama, Bush, and Clinton, starting with the election in 1992 of Bill Clinton, the election of George W. Bush, Bush 43 in 2000, and the election of Barack Obama in 2008. So all three of these men served 8 years in their presidencies, and that's generally the way it is. We've had only a few in my lifetime. We've only had two presidents, President George Herbert Walker Bush and President Trump, I guess, are the only two in my lifetime. No, excuse me, Jimmy Carter was also, that didn't serve 2 terms. So it'd be Carter, Bush 41, and Donald Trump that didn't serve for more than 1 term. So let's start out with this and put this guy's picture up here. As I mentioned the other day, he was from Arkansas, and he happened to defeat this man who had been so popular after the success of Operation Desert Storm. And as you recall, Operation Desert Storm was the United States trying to take Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And we successfully did that in 1991. And Bush had a popularity that was off the charts. It was like 90%. And yet he couldn't be reelected the following year because of a downturn in the United States economy, the recession. So let's talk a little bit about this guy. He presided over one of the great stock market increases, particularly in the NASDAQ, with tech stocks skyrocketing. He was an interesting man. He was a draft dodger in Vietnam. He was a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford in England. And he was somebody who really did like being president. I make the argument when I talk about Bill Clinton and I compare him to his successor, that I'll talk about in a minute here with George Bush, that Bill Clinton was one of these men who would wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and essentially say, what is it that I can do today to improve the welfare of the United States people? And yet at the same time, having said that, he was also one of the first presidents to say there's something wrong with the welfare system in America. Somehow or other, people are not working and benefiting from a welfare system. And this was an unusual position for Bill Clinton to take as a Democrat. He was what they generally call a moderate Democrat. He was from the South, and he had, you'll see here in a minute, I think I've got a picture of him here. Yeah, his vice president was this guy who was from Tennessee. So you had Bill Clinton from Arkansas and Al Gore from Tennessee, two contiguous states in the Mid-South, which is unheard of, to have somebody run with someone from the adjoining state. But they thought alike, they had the same views, and that's how they became, why he chose Al Gore as his vice president. Now, one of the sad things about Bill Clinton is what your generation generally knows about him. He was, of course, only the second president in United States history to be impeached. The first one being Andrew Johnson in 1863, after the, in 1868, I believe it was. It was after he became president after the assassination of President Lincoln. He was impeached, but he was not convicted. And so Clinton becomes only the second president to be impeached. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about that guy Nixon? Well, Nixon was threatened with impeachment, and he was not only threatened with impeachment, but had he been impeached, he would have been convicted. And his own party told him that. As I think I put a picture up a few weeks ago about this guy, Barry Goldwater, that had run against Lyndon Johnson. And Barry Goldwater went into the White House and told Nixon, Mr. President, over this Watergate thing, you're not only going to be impeached, but you're going to be convicted. And you'll be the first president to ever be removed from office forcibly. So Nixon resigned. Well, Bill Clinton was impeached. And there is a controversy about his impeachment as to why he was impeached. He was not impeached for having sex with an intern in the White House. He was impeached for lying about having sex with more than one woman before a grand jury. There was nothing in the Constitution that anyone could find that said that you are subject to impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors, and nobody could define high crimes and misdemeanor as having sex with an intern. But they could define high crimes and misdemeanors as being lying to a grand jury. So that's why he was impeached. However, when he went before the Senate, he was not convicted. And so he served out the next 2 years of his term as president. And so he was in office for 8 years. And when it was time for him to leave office in 2000, and here's just a couple of pictures. Clinton impeached. There's the Washington Post article. And this guy here, I used to put his picture up here. This guy's name is Ken Starr. And Ken Starr was the prosecutor against Bill Clinton. He prosecuted his impeachment trial before the Senate. And I used to put this picture up a lot because when I was teaching this course back in about 3 years ago, I would put this guy's picture up, And I would ask the question, does anybody know who this is? And nobody did. And then I'd say, do you know what what he's doing now? Once I said he was the prosecutor against Bill Clinton, nobody knew what he was doing. And at the time I was saying that is he was the president of Baylor University. And he got run out of being president of Baylor University because of his refusal to handle the claims of sexual assault by many athletes at Baylor University. Now, I think it's a little bit ironic that that's how he lost his job, having been the prosecutor against a president whose claim was to have done some very terrible things, if not impeachable things or not convicting things about women, and in this case, a very young woman. So I think it's interesting, and I want you to remember, though, that Bill Clinton's impeachment was not about his having sex. It was about him lying about having sex and lying about it in front of a grand jury, which was considered to be an impeachable offense, high crimes, and misdemeanors. So the election of 2000 is between George Bush and this guy, Al Gore, who had been the vice president of the United States under Bill Clinton. George Bush was the governor of the state of Texas. He was elected governor back in the late 90s. He was, of course, the son of President George Herbert Walker Bush. At the time he ran for governor of the state of Texas, he was the owner, a fraction owner of the Texas Rangers. Big baseball fan. Somebody who some would argue that within the Bush family, which included his brother Jeb, that in the Bush family, George Bush was not the most likely one to become president of the United States. It was probably going to be his brother Jeb, who at the time had been the governor of Florida. In fact, the two of them ran for governor. George Bush ran for governor of Texas. At the same time, his brother Jeb was running for governor of Florida, and George was elected and Jeb was defeated. Now later, Jeb was elected governor of Florida, but at the time, so some argue that if they had both won, Jeb would most likely have been the one who would have probably run for president. And some would argue was more of a political animal than this guy, George W. Bush. Some argue that the reason that George Bush even wanted to be president was because he had watched his father be defeated by Bill Clinton, and it gave him a chance to run against Bill Clinton's vice president. Now, it's always difficult when we talk about politics in this class of 270 students. As I've told you many times, I try not to be very political, but I was raised very much as a Republican. I always make the argument, and I think I may have told this class that I was raised such a Republican. My father was the only man to ever vote for Alf Landon, who was the governor of the state of Kansas and ran against President Roosevelt. So I was always raised that way. I worked when I was in college, when I was your age. I worked for Governor George Romney's election to be governor of the state of Michigan. Yes, he's Mitt Romney's dad. And then I worked on his presidential campaign too as a young college student. He didn't get elected, but he did run. So I was kind of one of those Michigan Republicans, which I guess would make me a modern day moderate Democrat or something. I don't know. Things are different today. But that's kind of the way I was raised. And so George Bush was an interesting guy to me. I really followed his career here in Texas because I had just moved here. And so I followed him. And he was an interesting guy. Well, he runs for election in 2000 in the year 2000 to take office in 2001. And of course, he runs against Al Gore. Now, this is, without a doubt, the closest election in American history. It is literally decided. The difference in votes is about 504 in one state, and that is the state of Florida. So I had just started my teaching career. I was living in Houston, Texas, and I taught at a place called, let's see, it was called, at the time, it was called Montgomery Community College, I believe. It's now called Lone Star College in the suburbs, northern suburbs up there. But it was, I was teaching political science. I still didn't have enough hours to teach history. So I was a political science teacher because that's what my master's degree was in. And I remember going to class on the Tuesday before, on the Monday before the election on Tuesday. And I think we met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I remember telling the class that it's possible that this election may be so close that when I come to school on Thursday, we won't know who the president is. Well, not only didn't we know on Thursday, we didn't know for another 35 days. Yes, literally, we didn't know for 35 days who the president was going to be. And the reason we didn't know that is because in Florida, there was such a close election in the state of Florida that would have made the difference on the Electoral College that you all know about. So the state of Florida decided to do a recount, but they couldn't decide whether to do the whole state of Florida or just to do the counties that were close down in the disputed counties of around Fort Lauderdale and Miami. So this went on and on and on. And literally, and you can YouTube this, you'll get a kick out of YouTubing, they literally were in some precincts, had these what we call IBM cards. I used to use them in Vietnam to analyze the success of pacification in the villages. And you would actually take a little pin and you would poke a hole in this IBM card. And when those holes were if you said, I want Bush, you punch a hole in this card, and that was Bush. But in some cases, the people didn't stick their pencil through the hole tight enough. And there was on the other side, the little piece of paper that's called a chad didn't fall out. And it became known as the hanging chads. So we literally had a situation where the auditors in the vote counters were holding these IBM cards up to the light to see whether the chad had come out, trying to decide whether or not that vote went to Bush or whether it went for Gore, or whether it didn't count because it was not voted properly. And of course, some of the districts used machines, different kinds of machines. So it was a very confusing situation. So finally, the decision was made that it had to go through all of the levels of the court system in America. So it started at an appellate at a court in Florida, then it went to the Florida Supreme Court, and then ultimately it went to the United States Supreme Court to decide who the president would be on the basis of what happened in one state. 504 votes was the difference. So the Supreme Court looked at the whole thing, and by a vote of 5-4, with a woman by the name of Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court by President Ronald Reagan, that court made a decision that it was proper to count those 504 victory, and Florida was awarded to George Bush over this guy, Al Gore, and George Bush became president of the United States. Now, without a doubt, this is the closest election in American history. So no matter what you think happened in 2020, this was closer. And no matter what you think, this guy, Al Gore, conceded. He conceded over 500 votes. And to this day, it is considered a little bit of a profile in courage that this man didn't put the United States through some of the things that we've gone through recently by saying, I lost. And George Bush became president of the United States. So that's 2000, okay? Bush will be president for 4 years. He will become president. He will be reelected president in 2004, even though he's wrapped up in a very controversial war in Iraq, in which we invaded that country because of ostensibly weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons of mass destruction have never been found. So some will argue that those weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War, the war of your generation, is sort of like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution attack of my war 50 years ago. So I want to tell you a little bit about this guy. President Barack Obama, elected in 2008. He runs against a Vietnam veteran by the name of John McCain. John McCain had been a POW for over 6 years in Vietnam. How did this happen? Well, I'm asking that question because at the time that Barack Obama was elected, my mom and dad were both still alive in 2008. My mom and dad both said that'll never happen. There will never be a black man elected president of the United States. My father actually had a connection to Barack Obama in that Barack Obama's grandfather, who actually raised him when his mom died, was a classmate of my father from kindergarten all the way to the 12th grade in a little town called Oil Hill, Kansas, El Dorado, Kansas. And so my dad knew Barack Obama's father very well. And you're not old enough to remember this from 2008. Most of you were 7 or 8 years old, but you might remember that there was a big controversy about who this man really was. First of all, his name was Barack Hussein. Middle name was Hussein Obama. And his father, his biological father, was from Kenya. And he was married to the granddaughter that I was just telling you about from Kansas. And then she died of breast cancer when he was young. But anyway, his mom moved to Hawaii, and that's where he lived most of his life. So there was a controversy about who this man really was. Now, it's obvious in looking at him that we can tell that he's black. The question was he may be truly African American because his father was from Africa. But there was a controversy about him. Not only was he his background is he'd only served in the Senate for not even a full term from Illinois. But then there was another controversy that was brought up by a man that you do know something about, a man by the name of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump made an argument that he wasn't eligible to be president of the United States because he wasn't born here, that he was probably born in Kenya, where his father was from. Well, again, I have a personal connection with with him through my father. And it was one of those things that was kind of silly on the surface, that he was an American and that he was, and that he actually, and through the efforts of a private citizen by the name of Donald Trump, forced to produce his birth certificate. No presidential candidate has ever been forced to produce their birth certificate, but he did, and it showed that he was born in Hawaii, which made him eligible to be president of the United States. So how did this happen? Well, let me show you a couple of graphs. How did this guy get elected? Well, first of all, we see, and I put up on the screen here a chart that shows Hispanic votes from 2000 to 2020. Particularly, I'm looking at 2010. If you see the rise from about 12% in 2000 to about 18% in 2010. This is Hispanic votes. And while this next screen is difficult to see and understand and read, and I apologize for that, what it essentially says is that there was a rise in Hispanic vote, there was a rise in in Hispanic percentages, and a rise in African American percentages. And these two minority groups voted in very high numbers for Barack Obama. And if we project that out, we can see what's happening all the way out to 2050, when the United States of America will be, by 2050, a minority country. A minority country. Now, when I talk about minorities, I'm talking about Hispanic, I'm talking about African American, I'm talking about Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and I'm talking about any Middle Easterners. If you add all of the people together that would not be called white, if you add all those up, you have a minority in the United States of America. And that's the success of Barack Obama's election, because not only were those numbers changing, but the people voted in higher numbers than they ever had. There was an excitement level that had not been seen, this was 2008, had not been seen ever as a percentage of eligible voters, had not been seen until 2020. And in 2020, we find a higher percentage of all Americans voting than we had ever seen before. I would argue, as an American, I would argue that that was very positive to see that happen. But it does show the change in direction that presidential candidates are going to have to use in order to get elected, because they're going to have to decide who can I attract? What are my policies? Why are they voting for me? All of those kinds of things are going to change American voter voting patterns. We saw it a little bit in 2020. What we saw in 2020 is certain percentages going for the current president, Joe Biden, and a high percentage of white Americans voting for, at that time, President Trump. So I throw this out to you just so that you'll recognize that there will be a change in your lifetimes as you move forward from white American majorities to minorities collectively representing the majority. With that, I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to stay with you today to help answer any questions you may have, not only about this lecture, this very short lecture, but this is now considered to be a review of the entire course, preparing you for, first of all, let me clear something up. Your examination is Friday. It's not Thursday, even though you would normally